On the afternoon of June 25th, 2016, a man arrived at his local Walmart supercenter in the city of Antioch, California. He wasn't actually there to buy anything. Instead, almost immediately after walking through the store's automated sliding glass doors, he headed directly for a very specific machine, one that was located in the business's lobby. Now, while the man was using this machine, nothing about his activity would have appeared out of the ordinary. In fact, this is him that you're seeing on screen right now in the grainy surveillance footage. Pretty boring, right? Well, what if I told you that before leaving the store that day, this man would put something into that machine? Something that would soon become extremely important. You see, just a few hours after this footage was captured, a disturbing crime would be committed less than 5 miles away from here. The item left in this machine would not only help to solve that crime, it would also reveal the totally twisted motive behind it. On the night of June 25th, 2016, a 39-year-old woman named Kathleen Rognaby pulled up to her house on the 1900 block of Bigelow Drive in Antioch, California. It was about 10:15 p.m., and she was accompanied by her 2 youngest children, Andrew and Amia. For the 3 family members, it had already been a busy day. Andrew's 10th birthday was coming up, and they were throwing him a party, so most of that Saturday had been devoted to running around to a bunch of different stores, getting the supplies that they needed. They had finished up the hectic shopping trip by having dinner at a local Chili's, and now all of them were more than ready to relax. Unfortunately, they had no idea that when they walked through the front door that evening, their night was far from over.
What's the emergency?
My cousin, he's laying on the floor in blood.
Is he alive?
I don't know.
Okay, do you feel like you can go in there and help him?
No, I don't want to go in there. I don't want to go in there.
The officers are driving there as fast as they can, okay?
I'm scared. What do I do?
The 911 call you just heard was placed by Kathleen Rognaby just moments after she and her kids entered the house. While she had headed towards her bedroom, Andrew and Amia had gone into the kitchen. It was here that they had encountered a disturbing scene. Their father, 43-year-old Relis Eastman, was lying on the floor. There was blood all around him. After hearing the kids scream, Kathleen ran to see what was wrong. Panicked by the blood, she grabbed them both and ran outside, where she called for help. When emergency responders first arrived at the scene, no one really knew what was going on. They, along with Relis's family members, assumed that there had been some kind of an accident. As paramedics and police ventured into the house, initially what they found appeared to support this idea. Relis was lying on his back right near the kitchen counter, and there was blood mainly around his head. The 43-year-old was breathing, but only slightly. The emergency responders wondered if maybe he had fallen and hit his head on the countertop on the way down. However, this quickly changed when they noticed something else. There were actually 2 wounds to the man's head. One was to the back of the head, while the other was directly on the other side on his temple just above his left eye. It all clicked into place when paramedics went to move Relis onto a stretcher and they found something that was trapped in his shirt. It was a mostly intact bullet that had mushroomed on impact. With that, it became clear that this was no accident. Relis Eastman had been shot. As Relis was rushed to the nearby John Muir Medical Center, detectives with the Antioch Police Department arrived at the house to begin their investigation. They didn't have to look around for long before they discovered more evidence that this was a crime scene. There was the blood, which, as previously mentioned, was all over the floor where the 43-year-old had been lying when he was found. This wasn't the only place where blood evidence was recovered, however. There was also spatter on a door which led into the kitchen from the garage. From this, detectives concluded that Relis had likely been shot from behind as he was walking into the house. Further evidence of this was found in the living room, where another bullet was discovered lodged in the screen of a TV. The television was in a direct line with the blood-stained doorway and appeared to have been hit head-on, suggesting that Relis' attacker had been standing in the doorway and had missed one of the shots that they had taken at him. Initially, detectives wondered if Relis had been attacked as part of a robbery gone wrong. Antioch is well known for being a high-crime area, and a botched burglary or home invasion was something that police had definitely seen before around here. As they looked around a little more, though, several things began to contradict this theory. Nothing appeared to be missing from the Eastman house, and the place showed no signs of being ransacked. On top of this, there was no forced entry at the property. Finally, if this was a robbery, why hadn't the perpetrator at least bothered to take Relis' cell phone and wallet, which were still in his pockets at the time that he was found? Investigators were even more intrigued when they had a closer look at the bullets recovered from the crime scene, which were determined to be .22 caliber long rifle rounds. This struck them as unusual. While .22 LR rounds are definitely capable of seriously injuring or killing a person, it's not the type of ammunition that authorities would normally associate with a crime like this. Because of their lower noise and recoil, .22 LR bullets are generally used for sport shooting or hunting minor pests, as well as with beginner shooters for marksmanship training. It led detectives to suspect that they might be dealing with someone who was inexperienced with firearms, maybe someone who had only used one a couple of times. Adding this together with the way that Relis had been shot, and the fact that there were no signs of a struggle, authorities came up with a new idea. Perhaps this wasn't an ambush. Maybe Relis had let his guard down because he knew his attacker. If that were the case, investigators knew where they needed to head next. They needed to speak to those closest to their 43-year-old victim. When Antioch police arrived at the John Muir Medical Center, Relis Eastman was in the intensive care unit. The 43-year-old was on life support, and it was still unclear whether he was going to pull through. By this time, a crowd of family members had started to gather at his bedside, among them Kathleen and his 5 children. Detectives now wanted to speak to all of them about what had happened. Most of the family members, including Relis' 2 oldest daughters, Aurora and Rebecca, told investigators more or less the same thing. Relis was an extremely devoted father who had worked hard to provide for their large family. Relis Eastman was born in June of 1972 and grew up on a farm in southwestern Kansas, right on the border of the Oklahoma Panhandle. After graduating high school in 1991, he joined the Army, where he served for 4 years. Upon being discharged, Relis settled in California and became a lineman technician for the telecom company AT&T. During this time, he also married Kathleen. The relationship wasn't Relis' first. Before this, he had a son named Scott with another woman. However, that relationship hadn't lasted for very long. Kathleen had helped to raise Scott from the time that he was 2, and she and Relis would go on to have 4 more children: Aurora, Rebecca, Amia, and Andrew. Aurora and Rebecca explained that their dad could be very strict. Sometimes it was annoying because he was always in everyone's business, but they knew that it came from a place of love. At the end of the day, his focus was always the family. Aurora described her dad as a workaholic, saying that he always took on extra hours at his job in order to try and provide the best type of life for all of them as possible. He was also trying to protect them from the dangers of the world, especially since there were a lot of bad influences in the area where they grew up. Relis particularly hated drugs and didn't want anything like that near them or in the house. The subject of drugs came up again when detectives spoke with Relis' oldest child, 21-year-old Scott Eastman. You see, by this time, authorities had actually found one more thing back at the crime scene that was of interest to them. While searching outside for additional clues, they found a backpack. Inside was some clothing, a wallet containing Scott's ID, and a small glass pipe and some marijuana. When asked about the bag and its contents, Scott admitted that they were his. Detectives asked the 21-year-old if he thought that maybe drugs could have been the motive behind the shooting. Did he perhaps owe money to anyone? Someone who might have tried to harm his dad or his family in retaliation. Scott said, no way, it wasn't like that. He didn't even smoke that often. It was just something he did with his friends every once in a while. The reason he kept the bag outside was because of his dad. He didn't think weed was that big of a deal, though obviously Relis disagreed. Scott said eventually he got tired of fighting with him about the situation, so he just started stashing everything outside instead. He figured what his dad didn't know wouldn't hurt him, and at the very least it would prevent a few arguments. When asked what he was doing at the time his father was shot, Scott said he had been hanging out with his friends, Damien and Skylar. The three of them were playing video games at Damien's house a couple of streets over when he got the call that something had happened. Authorities asked if Scott had been there the whole evening. He said yes, aside from a really brief point in time when he left to go take the car home. He usually drove the family Volkswagen, but Relis didn't like him having the car out at night. The rule was that he had to bring it back before sundown. Scott stated that he drove the car back, parking it a little ways down the street from the house. He said he never went inside, though, knowing that if he ran into his dad, he would try to make him stay home for the night. Instead, he headed right back to Damien's, which was only about a 5 to 10 minute walk away. Though investigators still weren't sure what they thought of what Scott had told them, there was one other interview that stuck out to them even more, the one they conducted with Kathleen. The 39-year-old painted a very different picture of the family's home life than what authorities had heard so far. When asked about her marriage with Relis, Kathleen said that, actually, they weren't married. They hadn't been for a while now, in fact. They had gotten divorced about 10 years earlier, but had continued living together. This was mostly for the children, Kathleen said, but was also at least somewhat a matter of convenience. It allowed them to pool their expenses and made sure that they were able to be covered under Relis's medical insurance. As far as a romantic relationship, Kathleen said that had ended ages ago. She and Relis slept in separate rooms and really didn't get along all that well either. According to her, this was Relis's fault. He hadn't been the greatest partner and had cheated on her constantly. Still, she said they managed to make the co-parenting thing work for the most part. After hearing all of this, detectives were understandably concerned. They wondered, was Kathleen just being brutally honest, or was there something else going on here? At least for now, they weren't sure. Fortunately, authorities were about to be hit with a wave of new developments. What would take longer to realize, though, was that the disturbing truth about what had happened to Relis Eastman was still hidden under the surface. Over the next couple of days, Antioch police detectives continued trying to uncover whatever new leads they could in the case. They did extensive canvassing of the Eastmans' neighborhood, looking for anyone who might have seen anything suspicious on the night of the shooting. They also asked homeowners in the area to provide any surveillance footage they might have from that day. Unfortunately, this process was slow and time-consuming. But in the middle of it, authorities received a couple new pieces of information. The first bit of information came from the crime lab, who explained that they had been able to narrow down the weapon likely used in the shooting. After examining the bullets recovered at the scene, an expert believed that they had likely been fired by a Harrington and Richardson 999. The gun is a kind of top-break revolver, meaning that it hinges open at the barrel so that it can be quickly loaded and unloaded. This was an even better lead than the .22 caliber ammunition, because the H&R 999 was an older style of revolver that was less common. The other thing that detectives learned was even more interesting. It turned out that Relis Eastman had a life insurance policy valued at over $1 million. They wondered, was this a potential motive? While this was happening, things weren't going well back at the hospital. Relis still hadn't regained consciousness since arriving there, and his condition wasn't improving. Sadly, his 44th birthday happened on June 27th, while he was lying there in a coma. A few days after he was brought to the ICU, the family was given an even more tragic update. Relis was effectively brain dead. On June 30th, so 5 days after the shooting, they made the impossible decision to take him off of life support. He passed away that same day. Aurora later described the heartbreaking situation in an interview, explaining that they had played Relis's favorite songs for him and that they were there with him when it happened. While this isn't expressly stated in any of the sources we came across, reading between the lines, it seems like Aurora was the one who had to make the final call to cut off the life support, possibly because Kathleen no longer had Relis's power of attorney. Now, that's an absolutely awful thing to have to go through at any age, but Aurora was barely 18 at the time, so I can't even imagine how hard that must have been for her. Of course, Relis's death didn't just make the situation more tragic, it also made it a lot more serious. This case had now gone from an attack to a murder. After learning about Relis's life insurance policy, detectives once again turned their attention back to his family. Specifically, one member of the family, Kathleen Rognaby. You see, around the same time that Relis died, authorities started receiving phone calls from some other people who were close to him. One of these phone calls stood out. It was from a friend of Relis's at work. This colleague told police the complete opposite of what Kathleen had during her initial interview. In particular, the friend claimed that it was Kathleen, not Relis, who had ruined the relationship with infidelity. According to them, she'd had numerous affairs with other men, all while Relis worked and supported the entire family. In the colleague's words, Kathleen was a manipulator who had walked all over Relis for years. At this point, authorities weren't sure what was true, so they brought Kathleen in for a second interview. They asked her some more questions, and she vehemently denied any involvement in the murder. Investigators also asked if they could go through her cell phone, to which she eventually agreed. Upon searching through the device, there was no question that Kathleen was involved in romantic relationships with other people. There were text exchanges between her and multiple men, some of which included intimate photos. Now, on its own, this wasn't a big deal. After all, Kathleen and Relis had been divorced for a decade, and she had already admitted that they were no longer in a romantic relationship together. However, the phone's internet search history also revealed something else. About 3 weeks before the murder, Kathleen had looked up Relis's life insurance policy. This led detectives to two possible ideas. Maybe one of the men Kathleen had been speaking with had gotten jealous of her living situation with Relis. Or, even darker, perhaps Kathleen had asked one of them to help her get him out of the way. When they had last spoken to her, detectives had been suspicious of Kathleen, but they got stuck when it came to her alibi. As previously mentioned, she had been out all day with her 2 youngest children when Relis was shot, and she had the receipts to prove it. If someone else were involved in the crime, though, that could change things. However, there were a few problems with the theory that Kathleen was involved in the crime. For starters, there was nothing actually incriminating on her cell phone. There were no suspicious conversations between her and a potential co-conspirator, and certainly nothing about a murder. The closest thing was that search about the life insurance policy. But here, too, it was questionable whether the 39-year-old would have had a motive. When police looked into the policy, they discovered the proceeds were only going to Relis's children. Kathleen had waived any right to the payout during the divorce. While detectives still weren't willing to rule Kathleen out just yet, they decided to move on to second interviews with other members of the family. Once again, all of these were pretty normal, until they arrived back at Relis's oldest son, Scott. When investigators sat down with Scott this time, he started to change significant details about his actions on the night of the murder. Specifically, the 21-year-old now claimed that instead of going straight home to drop off the car, he had instead made a quick stop at a store to buy a couple things. Detectives couldn't say for sure why Scott was changing his story, but they had an idea. You see, unlike Kathleen's alibi, Scott's version of events on the night of June 25th had been a lot harder to verify. By this point, detectives had spoken with his friends, Damien and Skylar, as well as Damien's father. All of the witnesses agreed that Scott had left the house that evening to drop off the family Volkswagen. However, no one could agree on exactly how long he had been gone for. One of the friends gave more or less the same story that Scott had, saying he was only gone for about 10 to 15 minutes. The other, though, said that it had been quite a bit longer. Then there was Damien's dad, who had actually answered the door when Scott came back. He said that it had been a full 45 minutes by the time Scott returned. Not only that, but when he got there, he looked pretty out of breath, like he had just been running. While this new detail about stopping at the store could potentially explain the gap in Scott's alibi, detectives quickly realized that it also produced an inconsistency. If you recall, Scott's wallet had been discovered in his bag back at the house when police first went to the crime scene. So what money had he used when he went to the store? The 21-year-old didn't seem to have an answer for this, at least not one that made sense anyway. As the conversation continued, it became more and more clear to detectives that Scott was hiding something. He was making stuff up, and he wasn't particularly good at it. It was partly for this reason that when he mentioned something else related to his visit to the store, it caught the attention of police. This detail came so out of left field and was so oddly specific that investigators ended the interview so that they could look into it. It turned out to be the single most important clue in the entire case so far. After finishing their interview with Scott Eastman, Antioch police made 2 phone calls. The first was to a local Walmart supercenter located about a 10-minute drive from the crime scene. The second was to a company called Eco ATM. If you have no idea what an Eco ATM is, don't worry, neither did I until I started researching this case. Basically, it's a little bank machine where you can sell your old phone instantly for cash. According to the company's website, the whole thing works like this. You go to one of their machines, put in some information about your phone, and then it gives you an offer based on what it thinks it's worth. Once you accept, you deposit your device into the machine and it dispenses the cash. The idea is that the phones can either be resold or properly recycled to help reduce e-waste. So, you might be asking yourself, why is this a big deal? Well, just like with Kathleen, detectives had asked Scott during their second interview if they could see his cell phone. He replied that they couldn't because he didn't know where it was. He had lost it before his dad's murder. However, towards the end of the conversation, when Scott was giving all those details about his alibi, he mentioned something about the store where he said he went. That store was the local Walmart supercenter, which the 21-year-old identified in a pretty unusual way. He said it was the one that had one of those Eco ATMs in the lobby. The reference was so strange that detectives were sure that it was important. When they called the Walmart, Antioch police requested the store's surveillance video from June 25th. Sure enough, it showed that Scott had gone to the store that day. The thing was, though, the 21-year-old was actually there several hours before the time he had given detectives. He also hadn't purchased anything. Instead, the 21-year-old had specifically gone there to use the Eco ATM. He had been there to get rid of his cell phone. After contacting representatives from Eco ATM, authorities were able to get into the actual machine. There was no question that it was Scott who had used the ATM. Obviously, the company knows that their product can potentially be used to sell stolen phones, so as a result, you have to use your driver's license every time you sell something there. Inside the phone deposit bin, police quickly located Scott's LG smartphone. Though the device had been wiped, using special software, investigators were able to recover a great deal of the phone's contents. What they found was nothing short of jaw-dropping. To begin with, the phone showed that Scott had spent weeks researching guns and ammunition in the lead-up to his father's murder. Not just any guns and ammo, though. He had been looking into the exact .22 caliber LR rounds that had been used to kill Relis, as well as the H&R 999 revolver that police already suspected was the murder weapon. He had looked up tons of information related to these 2 items, including where to get them, whether ID was required to purchase them, and perhaps most alarming of all, whether .22 LR bullets were powerful enough to kill a human being. Contrary to what Scott had told police, his phone also revealed that he was more than just an occasional weed smoker. His activities suggested that he was actually a budding drug dealer, one who had spent a significant amount of time hanging around on the dark web. Now, I'm assuming that most of you watching probably already know what the dark web is, but just in case, I'll give a really brief explanation. Basically, there's the internet that you and I commonly access, which is sometimes referred to as the surface web. This is the part of the internet that is readily accessible to us and is where the vast majority of people spend all of their time online. Below that, though, is something called the deep web, which is kind of like the vast unexplored ocean of the internet. This is all the stuff that isn't indexed by search engines like Google and is mostly hidden to us. It's not necessarily inaccessible per se, it's just stuff you probably wouldn't find unless you actually know where to look. Or else it's parts of sites that actively require a password to get into, like banking websites and stuff like that. Now, the dark web is part of the deep web, but it specifically refers to areas of the internet that can't be accessed by traditional web browsers. You need special software to get to dark web websites, and even then, many of them are designed to keep people out unless they know the site's purpose. As you might imagine, this makes the dark web the perfect place to host certain illegal activities, among them black markets that are used to buy and sell drugs. It turned out that Scott had been accessing the dark web to purchase a variety of drugs, including prescription pills, LSD, and ecstasy. The quantities suggested to detectives that he might have been selling the drugs that he purchased to others. If you can believe it, though, this wasn't even the most shocking thing that detectives found on Scott's phone. No, the thing that caught their attention the most was the hundreds upon hundreds of searches for adult content. Specifically, content involving relationships between stepmoms and stepsons. In addition to this, police found some of the same photos of Kathleen that they had previously seen that she had been sending to other men. In short, it was beginning to look like Scott was obsessed with his stepmother. After finding all of these disturbing clues, detectives went back to the Eastman family one last time to see if they could uncover any more information. What they learned helped to put the final pieces of the puzzle into place. According to the family members, a few months before his death, Relis had gone on disability from his job at AT&T. This meant that the normally very busy father was spending a lot more time at home. As previously mentioned, Relis could be strict when it came to rules for his kids, and with him now having a lot more time on his hands, he started to be a lot more vocal about enforcing them. For most of the kids, this was just a minor annoyance, but it started to cause major issues between Relis and Scott. They were arguing a lot, and there was constant tension between them. Things had really escalated a short time before the murder, though, when Relis had opened one of the packages full of drugs that Scott had ordered off the dark web before the 21-year-old could get to it. Relis was furious when he found out what Scott was up to, and wanted to kick him out of the house. However, Kathleen had talked him out of it. Even so, Relis kept an incredibly close eye on Scott after this. He wanted him home at certain times, forbid him from using the car unless it was within certain hours, and did other things to try and restrict his activities. He even bought security cameras, which he apparently purchased and was planning to install in large part so that he could catch Scott if he tried to sneak out of the house in the middle of the night. The last thing the family shared with police had to do with Relis' life insurance policy. Apparently, a few months before his murder, he and Kathleen had explained to the kids that they were all beneficiaries, meaning that Scott would have known that he was in for a potential financial windfall if his dad were dead. Based on everything they had uncovered, detectives came up with a theory. Scott had planned and carried out his father's murder both for financial gain and because of a twisted fantasy that he could somehow get together with his stepmom once his dad was out of the picture. Feeling that they now had a fairly compelling case, authorities brought Scott back in for one final interview. When they did, they told the 21-year-old that they knew he'd been lying to them and confronted him about everything that they had learned so far.
I like you the best, and I know that you feel the best when you're being honest. It's not forced. You don't have to think about it. Tell me about those searches. That came from my phone? Your phone, yes. No.
As you just heard, Scott tried to play dumb, even after he was presented with evidence. He continued to deny that he was involved, even going so far as to say the searches couldn't have been found on his phone, and that it wasn't him in the Walmart surveillance footage.
Now, this isn't like randomness. It's all from the same phone that I recovered from the kiosk that you dropped your phone off at. Tell me what that means. What the?
I mean, who did?
Who did?
I don't know.
So, I get when you might see something like this that you're like, God damn it. Like in your mind, you're like, that's not me. But the simple fact is that it is you.
Shortly after this point in the conversation, Scott asked for a lawyer. Understandably, police had been hoping for a confession, but it turned out they didn't need one, as 2 more discoveries would serve as the final nails in the coffin, so to speak. The first came when police received surveillance footage from a home close to where the Eastmans lived. An exterior camera there had captured Scott bringing back the Volkswagen on the night of June 25th. The video showed Scott parking the vehicle at 8:53 p.m. However, instead of heading back to his friend Damien's like he told detectives, the footage captured Scott walking in the direction of his own house. The 21-year-old didn't return until 9:14 p.m., nearly a full 20 minutes later. When he did, he could be seen putting something into the trunk of the car before finally running off. Police speculated that after dropping off the car that night, Scott had gone into the garage where he had encountered Relis. After shooting him in the back of the head, he had run back to the vehicle, stashed the murder weapon temporarily, and then gone back to his friend's place like nothing had happened. The second discovery that was made seemed to reinforce this theory. While searching around for a cigarette in the trunk of the Volkswagen a few days later, Scott's friend Skylar found a bullet. It was the same type of .22 LR round that had been used to kill Relis Eastman. On July 7, 2016, Scott Eastman was arrested for his father's murder. He was taken into custody at home in front of the rest of his stunned family members. When the case went to trial in the summer of 2018, Scott's defense team tried to pin the blame on Kathleen, arguing that she had committed the crime and had framed the 21-year-old afterwards. It's easy to understand why this was their strategy. Kathleen was the only other major suspect in the case, and police themselves were actually never fully convinced that Kathleen wasn't involved. In terms of why police felt this way, there are a couple of reasons that we know about. The first was that a few people actually came forward and told detectives that they had heard Kathleen say things about Relis before the murder that sounded incriminating. Things along the lines of, "My life would be better off if he were dead," and "if I could get away with killing him, I would." The second thing was a part of Kathleen's activities on the night of the murder that authorities always viewed as suspicious. It was the fact that she had actually driven all the way home that night, but then decided to go back out briefly to get gas before actually going into the house. The final thing, and I think the one that bothered authorities more than anything, was her reaction to being told that Scott was obsessed with her. In an interview we came across with one of the officers involved in the case, he just said that she had a really strange response to the whole thing, although he didn't really elaborate much on what that meant. While I can see where police are coming from here, if you ask me, these are all kinds of things that can look really bad in a certain light, but can also be totally meaningless at the same time. How are you supposed to react to finding out that your homicidal stepson, who you raised from the age of 2, is actually in love with you? Also, with the gas thing, I'm assuming the implication is supposed to be that Kathleen was stalling for time because she knew what was happening inside. But, sometimes people also just need gas. In terms of hard evidence, as far as I can tell, there was nothing actually linking Kathleen to the murder, and she was never charged with a crime. Ultimately, the jury didn't buy the theory that Scott's defense team presented either, and he was convicted of first-degree murder. In early 2019, he was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison, though because of his young age at the time of the offense, Scott will be eligible for parole as early as 2035. I know that some of you think that I remark too often that a story we've covered is the craziest one we've done in a while. But come on. In this case, you've got to agree with me. This is by far the most messed up thing I've heard in quite some time. Disturbingly, Scott Eastman apparently wasn't done terrorizing his family even after he was put behind bars. According to one of his half-sisters, when she stopped talking to him following his arrest, He started harassing her and even passed her number around to other inmates at the jail. Speaking of that, while I always feel terrible for the victims in these cases, I think in this case, I feel even worse for Relis' children. I can't imagine what it would be like to lose your father in such a tragic way, only to find out just a couple of weeks later that your older brother was responsible, and for such an absolutely twisted reason as well. The most heartbreaking statement about the whole thing that I read once again came from Aurora, who said this after her brother's conviction. Quote, "After what Scott did, we all changed so much. I don't recognize my family anymore. We lost a part of our world." Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.